Well, if you could ask God one question, what would it be? It's an old invitation. It's used as an opening discussion starter on things like Christianity Explored. And it gets a lot of reactions. Some say they'd want to know why the universe is set up a particular way. Some would want to know why there's war or disease or suffering, why something happened to them or to a loved one. And some would say they just want to have a go at God. That was famously Stephen Fry's answer a few years back, who said that if he stood before God, he'd confront him about all the cruelty and suffering of the world. Personally, I rather doubt that when that day comes, he'll be doing anything of the kind. But it's how a lot of people feel. Lots of people want to ask God questions. Today's reading shows people asking Jesus hard questions. And it comes in 4 episodes, 4 bits. In the first 2, people with an agenda come and ask him some of the hard questions of their day, trying to catch him out. Then in the 3rd, he asks them a question, turns the tables. And then in the last one, he gives a verdict on them, a verdict which explains why they've been going wrong and why they are so set against him. You see, they come to ask questions, hoping to pass judgment on Jesus. But in the end, it is he who passes judgment on them. They wanted to condemn him. In the end, it is he who condemns them, condemns the experts who tried to test him. Because when we try and pass judgment on Jesus, we end up judging ourselves. He is the king. We don't get to judge him. And when we try, it is our hearts that are revealed. So as we come to these 3 little bite-sized episodes, let's take a careful look at our hearts. And let's make sure we aren't falling into the same trap as them. Now, all this is happening in the last week of Jesus' earthly life before his death and resurrection. He has come to Jerusalem, the city of God, as the longed-for Messiah, God's king, God's savior. But the leaders of God's people, well, they've been rejecting him. They've been trying to get rid of him because they don't like what he's saying. They know he's not on their side, but they don't dare just arrest him, or the people who still love him will see and there'll be trouble. So they decide to take the clever option, the stealthy option. They've got to discredit him. And they actually come in disguise to try and ask a question that will get him into trouble. And they start off with a bit of flattery, butter the bread before you try and eat it. Teacher, they say, we know that you speak and teach what is right and that you don't show partiality, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Now, that's quite true, of course, but that's not why they say it. They say it to try and set him up for the trap they're laying. This big question, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And this was a trap, because everyone hated being ruled by the Romans and having to pay them taxes. Does anyone here enjoy paying taxes? Just out of curiosity? No, we don't like paying taxes to our own government. How bad would it be if we had to pay taxes to France, to pay for the French troops on the corner of the Heathway? We would probably be quite grumpy about it, wouldn't we? Well, everyone hated paying taxes to the Romans, not just because they were a foreign power, not just because it was taxes, but of course the Romans were a pagan foreign power. They didn't follow the God of Israel. They worshipped idols. They were a godless occupying force. And many zealots, many passionate Jews even said it was sinful for God's people to give money to a pagan king, to acknowledge the rule of an idol-worshipping emperor and support his reign. Maybe it was a sin to pay taxes to Caesar. It certainly wasn't popular. So if Jesus comes out and says, yes, it's fine to pay taxes to Caesar, then he's a traitor to his people. He condones the Roman occupation. He condones pagan rule, and they can tell everyone he's not a true Israelite, sucks up to the enemy, and they can break his support among the people. But if he says, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to them because they're a pagan occupier, then they can sneak off to the Romans and say Jesus is subversive. He's telling people they don't have to pay taxes, and they can get him condemned as a rebel, and the Romans will do their dirty work for them. It's a win-win situation, isn't it? They've got him either way. But you don't trap Jesus that easily. He goes and gets a coin, one of the standard coins that they used, and he gets them to show it to him. And it probably looked a bit like this. I hope, yeah, there we are. This is a Roman coin, emperor's head on one side. So he asks them, whose image is on it? The emperor, they reply. Now, in those days, if you wanted to show you own something, you put your image on it, your mark on it. So Jesus says, in effect, you see, the coins you're using belong to him. You're already using his coins, so yeah, you might as well give some of them back to him in taxes. But giving some of Caesar's coins back to Caesar mustn't get in the way of giving to God what is God's. And that's much more important than just the money. Now, besides being a really clever answer, this has a few implications for us, I think. It tells us that there are things it is right to give the government. Christians can sometimes look at our governments, which definitely have their faults, and talk as if we owed them nothing and Christians are above the law. We aren't. Or we can be always looking for points of conflict and criticism. Some of us are probably more prone to striking a defiant pose and looking for a fight than we should be. And Jesus says there are things that lawfully belong to rulers, and that includes taxes, like it or not. And remember, Jesus says this not about a nice, friendly Jewish king. He says it about pagan, oppressive military tyrants who are quite happy using force to slaughter civilian dissent. This isn't a nice government, but Jesus says you still pay to Caesar what is Caesar's. So if it holds true for them, it definitely holds true for our governments, however much you may dislike them. We are citizens of heaven, but for now we're also citizens of earth. And Christians should be good citizens of earth, whenever that doesn't conflict with God's law. Giving God what is God's comes first, but where it's not in conflict with that, we should be the best of citizens. Christians should be law-abiding, dutiful citizens who pay their taxes, drive at the speed limit, and vote, not just when we're being watched and out of fear of punishment, but all the time, out of conscience, because that is what is due to Caesar. That is right. But, and this is a really big but, this shouldn't stop us giving to God what is God's. Jesus says that it isn't either Caesar or God, but that being a good citizen shouldn't get in the way of giving God his due. So he turns the question back on them. Do you give to God what is God's? Some of Jesus' hearers were zealots, out looking for a fight and not giving Caesar his due. Others were Sadducees, compromisers, too much in bed with the Romans and too influenced by them. See, being obedient to the government, to Caesar, shouldn't mean not giving God his due. And maybe that's the danger for many of us today, where there's a lot of cultural pressure to walk away from God's commands for the sake of pleasing those around, those in power. Give to God what is God's. Others in Jesus' day, and perhaps in our own, were just distracted, so concerned with the big public issues of Roman occupation that they weren't living for God day to day. Or they used their political zeal to excuse their private sin. I'm obviously righteous because I oppose Roman rule, and therefore I'm not going to consider that I might be sinful in how I treat other people. But again, Jesus says it isn't either or. Give to God what is God's. Maybe there's a danger that we can be terribly zealous for him in the public sphere, before the eyes of men, but fail to give him love and obedience in private. I meet some Christians who are very passionate about the problems with our society, the dangers of woke culture, the issues with godless secular politics, but then their own lives don't show very much grace or love to those around them. That's a danger. We can be distracted. Give to God what is God's first, and then give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Following God doesn't get you out of giving Caesar his due, and complaining about Caesar doesn't get you out of giving God his due. Give to God what is God's. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. That's episode 1. Episode 2, the second encounter, that's a little bit different. This time it's the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the priestly faction amongst contemporary Judaism. They were the wealthy ones, the high status ones, the ones at the center of power. They were very, we would say, theologically liberal. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament as God's word. They didn't believe in angels or spirits. They didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see. I'm sorry, but it is compulsory. They didn't believe in anything supernatural. But their big difference from other Jews at the time was that they didn't believe in the resurrection. And they know that Jesus does. So they come trying to trip him up with what they think is a foolproof trick question, exposing the silliness of believing in resurrection and life after death. And it depends on this old law from Deuteronomy, a law that sought to protect widows who didn't have any children and people who died without any children whose family name was in danger of disappearing. If you didn't have any children in those days, you had no one to look after you in old age because no social services. So there was a law that if someone died without children, his brother should marry his widow and have children with her. So she would have a family and the dead man's name would be carried on. And the Sadducees pick up this old law and they decide, we're going to use it to trap Jesus. And they paint a picture of this ridiculous scenario where this poor lady ends up married 7 times to 7 different brothers. It does sound like the plot of a rom-com or something, doesn't it? It's a bit implausible. But anyway, they say, just imagine this happens. If there's a resurrection of the dead, which one's going to be her husband at the resurrection? Or is she going to end up with 7 husbands, poor lady? And they think they're pointing out how ridiculous Jesus' teaching on the resurrection is. But again, he turns it back on them and shows them that the problem is with them, with their small and ignorant and mistaken image of what God has in store for his people. Because Jesus says, marriage is a thing of this world, not of the world to come. There won't be marriages there. Marriage is something that points towards heaven. It acts out in a small, imperfect way the passionate, unconditional love that God has for every one of his people. It acts out in a tiny, tiny shadow of the joy and the celebration of the marriage banquet in heaven when God is united to his bride. Marriage at its very best is a taster, a shadow, a trailer for the main event, which is the union of God and his people. And when the reality is there, we won't need the pointer. There will be something even better. See, the Sadducees, their vision of God was very small. They imagined that if there was a heaven, it would be like earth. That God's new creation would be like the world of men. And don't we always do that? We measure God by our own standards. We take this world for the only reality just because it's the only one we've seen yet. And we imagine all God's work will be like our work. But we know the resurrection won't be like this life. It will be as different as a flower is from a bulb, from a seed. It will be something wholly new. Jesus says that those who take part in the resurrection won't marry and they won't die. They'll be like the angels. They won't be like they are on earth. Sometimes we need a bigger vision of what God is going to do with us, because the resurrection will be better than anything we can imagine. It will be greater than anything we can dream of. And we can cling to the things of earth very hard because sometimes they're very good. I'm reliably informed that a good marriage is very good. There are many good things in this life, sunshine and flowers and pizza. But what God has in store for us is so much better. If we cling too hard to this life, we miss what we were made for. And so Jesus then goes on to challenge the Sadducees' belief that there is no resurrection, because he wants them to realize that there is. And so he points them to one Bible book that they would acknowledge was from God, which is Exodus, one of the first 5 they did accept. And he says, look, here in your favorite book, God introduces himself in the account of the burning bush. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am. And he says he's not a God of the underworld. He's not a God of the dead. He's a God of life, a God of the living. So if he's still their God, there must still be life for them. There is life beyond death for them and for us and for all who die in Christ. And it will be better than the best thing we can imagine in this life. God is not bound by human constraints. God is not bound by what humans do. And what he has planned for us is so good that even the best things on earth will be a shadow and a taste of it. Sometimes, like the Sadducees, we let our doubts and our uncertainties drive us into just clinging to what we know, to the things of this world, and questioning whether God could have anything better in store for us. Jesus tells us, you have no idea what God has prepared for those who love him. But one day you will. Episode 2. And now the third episode, the third bit, sees Jesus turn the tables and start questioning his opponents. The teachers of the law, the religious experts of the day, they taught that the Messiah was the son of David, the descendant of David. And so they expected him to be someone like David, more of the same. David Mark II, a conquering king who would beat up everyone around them and make their kingdom glorious and wealthy and wonderful. And so they squished their vision of the Messiah, into a little David-shaped box. All he could be was the conquering king. And so when Jesus came, the king who was going to conquer death by dying, well, he didn't fit in their box. And so they didn't recognize him. And so they rejected him because he wasn't giving them what they wanted. And so they didn't have any time for him. I couldn't see he was giving them something far better. And so Jesus points out that in the Psalms, David himself calls the Messiah Lord, Master, Boss, Sir. Parents who have a son, how often do you call him Sir? Anyone call their son Sir? What about Boss? No? Somehow I'm not surprised. Jesus' point is very obvious. If David is calling the Messiah who is to come Lord, he must be somebody bigger than David, someone greater than David, greater than just David Mark II, certainly, bigger than just a new conquering king of Israel. He shows the teachers of the law that their idea of the Messiah is too small. And it gives them one last chance to recognize that what God has planned is so much bigger. One last chance to recognize the Messiah as he stands before them. I wonder if we're very good at having too small an idea of God, of squashing him into a box of our ideas, what we think he's like or want him to be like. There's an old saying that I love. God created man in his own image, and ever since man has sought to return the compliment. Christians in the Middle Ages imagined God like a medieval king, strict and hierarchical, passing down judgments from his throne, and only to be safely approached through his mother when he was in a good mood. They imagined him in their own image. Christians in the 18th century imagined God as a sort of gentleman scientist who cared about things being orderly and decent and otherwise left you alone, and wound up the world like a toy watch and then left it to run. Others have imagined Jesus as a social revolutionary, only concerned with overturning the class system, or a therapist only concerned that we feel good about ourselves. We're very good at squishing our idea of God down into a little box of what we want, a little box that looks like us. Maybe we read that God is love, and we assume that must mean he never wants us to feel bad or be challenged or criticized, because our idea of love is that it only ever affirms, never challenges, never tells us hard truths. But God's love is truthful enough to confront us with painful facts, especially when we're going wrong and need to change our course. I wonder what other boxes we might have that we try and fit God into. Because the trouble is, if you try and build a little box for God. He won't fit. You might end up missing him when he comes to visit. The Sadducees had too low an expectation of the resurrection. Other teachers of the law, they had far too small an expectation of the Messiah. The Messiah who was coming was going to do everything that David had done and much more. But he wasn't going to do it the way they expected. He wasn't going to bring them glory and prosperity in this world, which was what they wanted. He was going to bring them peace with God and a resurrection that was better than anything this world had to offer. But they didn't want it, and so their eyes were closed. And therefore, the final episode shows Jesus, having finished answering all their questions, turn to the people who have been listening and watching this debate and give his verdict on the experts, the teachers of the law, the authorities who have been challenging him. It's not a very positive verdict. It isn't flattering. Because sometimes our attempts at judging God, always our attempts at judging God, end up revealing more about us than about him. We are the ones who end up judged. Jesus' judgment is a warning. He's debated with the experts. Now he turns to the people and says, stay away from these guys. Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. Such men will be punished most severely. In other words, they're in it for what they can get. They're in it for wealth and status and show. Flowing robes in those days were a status symbol. They showed you were wealthy enough not to have to work with your hands, so you could afford to wear something impractical and colourful. They were the Armani suit and the BMW of the day. Jesus is saying, these men are supposed to point you to God, but all they're pointing you to is themselves. And isn't that all too common, sadly? Throughout history, religious leaders have often been far more concerned with what they can get, whether that's the obvious stuff like money or the far more subtle drug of people's respect and admiration than they have been what they can give of God. Even today, I very much fear we have a lot of leaders who are more concerned with looking good in the media or on Twitter than faithfully pointing people to Jesus. Now, that can be a bishop with flowing robes and a palace and a PR officer, but it can also be ministers and speakers who just play to their audience and tell them what they want to hear. Whether that audience is the world or whether it's a group of Christians who they know will like a particular message. Someone can look like a faithful Christian leader saying all the right things, only because what they really love is being liked and respected by their world of other Christians. Status makes a very easy idol. Being liked and loved and respected and looked up to, it is more addictive than heroin. And it doesn't come with any warning label. That's the lure and drug that we're exposed to from the very first time we start hanging out with friends at school. Whether it's trying to be the popular kid aged 5 or trying to get a big following aged 50. It's a very powerful drug. And it makes us cling to this world. It makes us dance for the audience of people and not for God. Where did all these experts in the law who knew their Bible so well, where did they go wrong? Some of these people would have memorized the Old Testament. Hands up if you have. Well, I'm very relieved no hands have gone up. I didn't have to feel so bad. These were experts, but this was where they went wrong. They were hooked on the drug of success and status and not looking to God. It's very easy to see faults, especially these faults, in our leaders. And it's right to watch out for them. But this is a danger for all of us, I think. Money and status are awfully tempting, awfully addictive. Being liked and looked up to is a very powerful thing. I'd be very surprised if there's anyone here who doesn't like being admired and loved. But how much of our Christian life can end up being about chasing that rather than following Jesus, the one who went to shame and death for us? That was where the teachers of the law went wrong. That was where the people of God in Jesus' day, by and large, went wrong. See, they wanted a Messiah who would bring them glory, make them looked up to and respected and prosperous and wealthy. And so they imagined one in David's image who'd conquer everyone around. They wanted to be considered wise, not crazy and a bit kooky. And so they dropped the idea of the resurrection and their belief in the supernatural for the sake of looking sophisticated. They didn't like being made to look bad by Jesus over the previous few days, so they tried to trip him up and get rid of him with clever questions about taxes. That's the thread flowing through these 4 episodes, I think. But when they questioned him, it was their hearts that were revealed. Questions are a powerful thing. Asking somebody questions is the best way to learn. And if you have genuine questions, come and ask them of God. He will delight to help you answer them. But these questions aren't about learning from Jesus, but judging him. And when we try to judge him, it's us who end up judged. The questions and the challenges of the teachers of the law revealed what they were living for, what was most important to them. What's most important to you? What's most important to us? Because these episodes show us Jesus, the master debater. Jesus finding a path between conflict and compromise with Rome. Jesus who is greater than David. Jesus who reaffirms the hope of the resurrection. And they also show us when we're more in love, what happens when we're more in love with this world than with him. How we can end up either compromising to try and hold on to what we have in this world, if we've got a good position, much to enjoy, respect and status. We can end up compromising for that, like the Sadducees, climbing into bed with Caesar and the world around to try and hold on to what we have. Or we can end up like the Zealots, fighting to win more in this world, picking fights that don't need to be fought, dreaming of a leader who will crush the enemies and see them driven before us, but missing the true glory of God's Messiah, who came as suffering servant to win us peace with him, who came to die so that death could be defeated and we could rise to something a whole lot better, the union with God we were made for. He is better than flowing robes and good seats, better than Armani suits and BMWs. He is better than the love of man. He is better than the best marriage. He is better than anything this world has to offer. Let our gaze be on him today. Amen.